In the previous video, we explored why Qing China maps from the 18th century only show Taiwan's western plans due to the government not having the money or resources to govern the eastern side of Taiwan's central mountain range. But the money wasn't the only factors. There was also a big strategic reasons, stopping Han settlers from expanding too far inland. If you take a look at the 18th century Qing maps, you will notice they often have the phrase barbarian border maps on them. This barbarian border were not just decorative lines, they marked the edges between what the Qing actually controlled and what they didn't. This weren't one-fits-all boundaries either. Some were red lines maps, some blue, some purple, some green. The boundaries kept changing throughout the 1700s. Collectively, they were known as earthen oxen barbarian border. In this episode, we will dissect these boundaries lines, how they came to be, and how they tie into the major reforms during the Emperor Yongzheng's reign in the 1720s. We will also uncover how those reforms triggered the largest Cook barbarian uprising in Taiwan history, and events that spread across what is now Changhua, Taichung, Miaoli, and Nantou. Now, why did the Cook barbarian rise up in Barbarian? Let's dive in and find out. I would like to take a moment to thank the Simpson Center and the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Washington for their generous support for this series. I especially recommend subscribing to UW's Taiwan Studies program YouTube channel. There you will find a wide range of lectures, panels, and events offering fresh perspective on Taiwan studies from North America. Very grateful to the Simpson Center and Taiwan Studies for their support. As we mentioned in the last episode, in 1683, after the Qing Navy under Shilang defeated the remnants of the Ming Dynasty loyalists in Taiwan, Emperor Kangxi wasn't all that eager to keep Taiwan. In fact, he turned down proposals to officially incorporate Taiwan into the empire several times. But Shilang made a persuasive case. If they didn't keep Taiwan, it might become a rebel base again, threatening the tax-rich coastal provinces of the southeastern China. That convinced Emperor Kangxi to hang onto the island. But keeping Taiwan didn't mean fully developing and maintaining it. It wasn't quite the opposite. The Qing were all about keeping the cost low, a classic imperial strategy. From a tax and development perspective, only the western agrarian plans of Taiwan, especially around the modern-day Tainan, were variable to the government. The mountainous region, not so much. No farms meant no taxes. No taxes meant no budget for administration and law enforcement. So the Qing policy was clear: prevent rebellions with the most economical model possible. As part of this strategy, the Kangxi administration ruled out law beginning Han settlers from bringing their families to Taiwan. The idea was to limit population growth while still allowing immigrants. As a result, Han society in Taiwan at that time was mostly made up of a single man known as barefoot bachelors. Additionally, the Han settler communities were exhausted from years of instability and warfare, and their numbers had dwindled. But even with minimal governance, running the island still cost money, and that meant heavier taxes on the people who remained. Funding and maintaining executive and military divisions on the island is nearly impossible for the lack of funds. Combine rising taxes with bans on family-based immigration, it's easy to see how government induced pressures pile onto the Han settlers. There is essentially no effective growth in the population. As distress tension built up, in 1721, Zhu Yigui, a man from Zhangzhou, led a large-scale uprising. His rebel forces even captured the Qing capital of Taiwan, modern-day Tainan. Though the revolt was quickly suppressed by the government, it exposed the growing societal instability caused by the restrictive policy. Some Qing officials thought the answer was more restrictions, but others, especially those based in Fujian, began to realize maybe the real problem was the restrictive policies. Say Gao Qizhuo, the governor general of Fujian and Zhejiang, In 1727, he told Emperor Yongzheng, "The people settling in Taiwan have no families and have no plans to settle down. Without parents, wives, and children to care of course, they are up to no good. Let them bring their families. People with something to lose are less likely to rebel." Yongzheng, who was all about imperial reformation at the time, took his advice seriously. Beijing gave the green light to the reshape Taiwan's social structure. Even with families allowed, there was another serious issue for 18th century Taiwan: Han settlers encroaching on indigenous lands. From the early Qing period, imperial policy tried to segregate the ethnic group. Han settlers should stay in Han areas, barbarians, the indigenous people, should stay in their territories. Ideally, the two sides wouldn't mix. On the western plains, Han settlers lived side by side with the Cook barbarian tribes. The Qing did not put in additional fiscal efforts to govern these tribes directly. In fact, they hoped the Cook barbarian tribes could act as a buffer against Han settlers. The government expected them to defend their land against the Han, thus keeping the rebels in check. Imperial laws also strictly forbade Han settlers from encroaching on indigenous land. But here's the catch: Han settlers from Fujian and Guangdong came to Taiwan to own land, so these rules seemed too restrictive for their test. To get around them, settlers pulled a clever trick. They claimed that they were just sharecroppers working for the tribes. That's the way, when they cleared land, it wasn't Han expansion. They were just helping out their Cook barbarian landlords. Totally legal, but in reality, the indigenous people slowly lost control of more and more land. The loopholes in law allowed the Han colonists to encroach on indigenous lands. By the time Yongzheng came to power, his situation had gotten severely out of hand for the government. Vast tracts of land and resources outside official boundaries were being farmed by Han settlers. They were uncontrollable. The emperor was not okay with this. His reform aimed to track down the unregistered farmland, bring it under government control, and make it taxable. The first priority is to excavate the unregistered farmlands. In the same year of the 1724, the Qing lifted the old restrictions. The Ministry of Revenue announced, within the Fujian province of Taiwan, if there is an undeveloped land in barbarian territory, under the acknowledgement of an official, Han and Cook barbarian parties may both cultivate it. This translates to, anyone could now legally develop a so-called Westland in indigenous areas, once local officials approve. You can probably gauge what happened next. Han settler groups flooded in, invaded and occupied massive areas of historical indigenous tribes, deer hunting grounds, and farmland. Fast forward to 6 years later, 1730, the regional chief official in Taiwan at the time, Liu Fanchang, proposed a new tax policy. If the barbarians could farm like the Han, they should pay taxes like the Han, eliminating differences of taxing the two groups. This issue dives deeper into taxation processes of Taiwan on the Qing rule, which we will not fully discuss today. But generally, taxes in Taiwan were split into Minxiang, which are in-kind taxes from Han settlers, and Fanxiang or Sexiang are cash taxes from Cook indigenous tribes. While the situation varied case by case, the latter were commonly lighter and more favorable. It became one of the reasons Han settlers pretended to be tribal tenants. Lower taxes and more government promised protections. Liu proposed to end the distinction. Han and Cook barbarian would be taxed equally. Given that the proposal sounds objective conceptually, what did this actually mean in practices? Han settlers that had an economic advantage to begin with could now encroach Cook barbarians' land outright as a Han-owned land. The tribes lost government's guarantee land rights protections. Large areas of land are now owned by the Han wealthy families. With their lands rapidly vanished, the Dajiaxi tribe of central Taiwan had had enough. In 1731, they attacked Qing officers in modern-day Shalu, Taichung. This is the historical barbarian rebellion. The central indigenous tribes teamed up with the nearby tribes to raid Han settlements. Soon, this turned into a massive joint rebellion stretching across the central region, attacking colonists who stole away their land. Taiwan's top military commander Wang Jun wrote, "On the second day of the leap 5th month, multiple indigenous tribes, Sanya, Niuma, and others, forced more to join the Dajiaxi tribe revolts. They surrounded the city, invaded the military camps, and injured our soldiers. Attacking from the northern ends of the Danshui to the south nearing Zuluo, they ravaged and burned village, destroyed crops, and shot Han settlers. Estimate of towns, cemeteries, and roads across the radius of 1,000 Chinese meters were blocked. About 50 tribes are participated. It is hard to tell which barbarian is an ally and which is not. Tens of thousands of Hans are under attack, filling to Zuluo." Let's take a look at this map. Courtesy of one of the most significant scholars of barbarian border, Ke Zhimin. This map is free to public viewings. Feel free to look more in depth if you are interested. This map depicts the indigenous uprising that broke out in the 1731. Over here is the Changhua city, and that's the Lugang. The main battlegrounds of the conflict was near the Dajia River. The red house icons represents the indigenous clans, aboriginal communities that revolted. Just as mentioned in historical records, the Nantou community and Dajiaxi community in present-day Taichung, and others as far north of Tunxiao in Miaoli, and as far east as Shalianzai and Sizai communities. It was most definitely a large-scale incident, amassing across Changhua, Taichung, Miaoli, and Nantou. The blue and the blue-green lines on the map trace roads taken by the Qing dynasty government troops. The rebellions was suppressed within a year, but from Wang Jun's written accounts and this map, we can pinpoint the essence of the uprising. The indigenous communities on central Taiwan had finally had enough of the Han settlers' exploitation and land grabs. It is not hard to imagine that Han settler groups who were pushing northward into indigenous territory were firmly into the pro-war camp. They strongly opposed the pro-pacification factions within the Fujian provincial government, fearing that they newly gained the lands might be handed back to the indigenous people. The confrontational settlers aligned with like-minded local officials and rallied lower-class Han residents from various villages to join the fight. Interestingly, in this turmoil, even Han settlers from Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, who usually clash violently with each other, set aside their rivalries. They joined forces with the only indigenous community to fight against the rebel tribes. According to records, after the conflict ended, over 1,000 Han individuals were honored as righteous subjects for their role in quelling the uprising. Why did the Zhangzhou and Quanzhou Han settlers swarm enemies in many past skirmishes, suddenly cooperate with the only community to suppress the rebellion? A historical account from the Japanese colonial period might shed some light. In a study of Taiwan's indigenous administrations, Ino Kanori cites a decree from the Yongzheng era when the Niuma and Salu communities rebelled. Fujian General Wang Jun and the Imperial Censor Jueluo Boxiu issued a proclamation to the people of Taiwan. Anyone who could capture and kill rebellious barbarians would be rewarded with land and cattle. What does that mean? It means that anyone who helped suppress the uprising would be rewarded with land and cattle. And whose land and cattle were those? The very indigenous communities that had risen up. I mean a web of a complex and often conflicting motivation from various factions. In this uprising of the indigenous peoples in central Taiwan, the Qing government actually garnered support from some unexpected quarters. Certain Han settler forces later pressed as righteous subjects, and even a few previously weaker indigenous communities such as Anli communities, which we have already mentioned, and the Xingang community up north in Miaoli. In contrast, the more powerful aboriginal groups of central Taiwan like Dadu and Dajia communities came out of rebellion significantly weakened. On the other hand, the Anli communities, which had chosen to side with the Qing government and Han colonial settlers, began to rise in prominence. In fact, their local leader Dunzai Adawai, known by his Han name Pan Dun, even traveled to Beijing with Taiwan's regional military commander Wang Jun to have an audience with the Yongzheng Emperor after rebellion. From the point on, Anli local leaders became strong allies of the Qing imperial authorities. After the rebellion was suppressed, the Yongzheng emperor and his official came to a sobering realization. The empire's recent reform policy had perhaps unintentionally weakened their cook barbarian allies, while emboldening Han settler groups with a history of stirring unrest. The emperor's earlier policy of opening up indigenous territory to Han settlements in early Yongzheng years had in fact contradicted the empire's long-standing approach to governing Taiwan, namely keeping a tight leash on Han expansion. Instead of strengthening control, the new policy had only accelerated Han encroachment into indigenous land. Realizing this, Yongzheng abruptly slammed the brakes on reform. He sought to return to the older policy of setting off certain territories, limiting Han settlers to inner boundaries of the barbarian border, and restoring the lands to the cook indigenous communities. So in the wake of the rebellion suppression in 1732, one urgent issue arose. Should the farmland that Han settlers had already claimed and registered with the authority, but which had originally belonged to the indigenous peoples, be returned to its original owner? At this point, I suggest pausing for a moment and thinking through, if you were in charge, what would you do? Some might propose that land seized by the Han settler through manipulation and force should simply be returned to the indigenous communities, but it would have led to one clear outcome: mass unemployment among the lower class Han settler. Let's be honest, no matter how policies shift, it's never the wealthy elite who suffer. If this lower class Han settlers suddenly lost their farmland, it would almost certainly have triggered a fresh wave of social unrest across Taiwan. Even though the Yongzheng wanted to revert to the earlier policy of restricting Han settlements in indigenous territories, he wasn't just a protester shouting from the sidelines. He was the one actually in charge. And like any ruler with real responsibility, he hesitated. After all, the Qing Empire was already grappling with an increasingly unstable situation in its northwest frontiers. The Changhua Khanate was mobilizing troops and preparing to invade Khalkha Mongolia. The last thing Yongzheng wanted was to open up a second front, and on a remote island like Taiwan, no less. To complicate things further, the local government in Fujian, the province directly responsible for administering Taiwan, strongly opposed any return to the restrictive settlements policy, warning that such a reversal would inevitably spark new unrest, and urged the emperor not to take such an idealistic approach. In the end, Yongzheng didn't have enough time to resolve the issue. He passed away just 3 years later, in 1735. Then came a new ruler, the Qianlong emperor. Upon taking the throne, Qianlong quickly approved a more moderate proposal from Fujian authorities. The new policy allowed Han settlers to retain any indigenous land they had acquired through formal purchase. That is, if you had a signed contract to prove it. But any land occupied without such a documentation would now be considered unauthorized and had to be returned to the indigenous. As a result, some land was given back to the indigenous people, but not all of it. You could say it was a 50-50 compromise, wins and losses for both sides. The new Qianlong administrations share a similar outlook to late Yongzheng rule when it came to governing Taiwan. The belief that the best way to control Han expansions was to revive the ethnic segregation policies first established in the late 17th century. But by mid-1730s, nearly half a century had passed. The social and political conditions that once made such a segregation viable had largely disappeared. Han settler groups from mainland China had already entrenched themselves as a dominant force in Taiwan. Meanwhile, many of the indigenous tribes had grown significantly weaker, especially after the reform of the 1720s. Even strong and cooperative groups like the Anli tribe had to contend with the reality that large parts of their traditional territory had already been overtaken by Han expansion. So put yourself in Qianlong's shoes for a moment. What would you have done? At that point in time, the empire needed Han settlers to farm and to generate agrarian value, essentially to fund the local governments and military presence in Taiwan. But simultaneously, Qing officials feared these same settlers they govern. They worry that Han population, if left unchecked, could become a breeding ground for future unrest, maybe even launching another anti-Qing rebellion. Under these conditions, what kind of policy would you implement? In the next video, we will explore exactly that. The Qianlong era strategy to contain the Han colonial class, the three-tier ethnic zoning system. Stay tuned.